What's up, makers? Mike Clifford here, and this time I'm a industrial maker. I'm going to show you how I created my dream bedroom. Now, in addition to the bed itself, I also built surround cabinets that give me tons of storage. I built 2 floating nightstands with soft close drawers. I added flush undermount LED lighting to serve as reading lights above the bed. I added LED lighting underneath the bed. I added a glass touch panel on either side of the bed to control the LED lighting. Lastly, I added a big leaf maple live edge slab headboard behind the bed. So let's get going and see how it was done.
Oh yeah, and since it's a really long project, I put links to the specific sections in the video description below so that you can jump right to whatever part you want to see right now really easily. In my mind, this seemed like a really simple remodel to start with. I was going to demo and remove an old bed that I'd built in my pre-YouTube days, and also remove some built-in IKEA PAX wardrobes, and then replace those with a new bed where the wardrobe had been. I say that it seems simple because it actually turned out to be about the most challenging project I've ever done. I made so many mistakes that I actually struggled for a minute with whether I should even release this video, but ultimately I decided that people could learn from my mistakes and that there are some other techniques in here that people might find useful. The first challenge was the seemingly simple task of breaking down the 10 sheets of plywood to be used for the bed and surrounding cabinets. I can't fit a 4x8 sheet of plywood into my elevator to take it down to my basement shop, so I had to start the process of breaking everything down in my garage, which meant setting up a temporary shop there to do that. I could then take everything down to my shop where I could cut out all the pieces that I would need to make up the cabinets and the bed. So we've got the sides of the cabinets that are going to go to the sides and on top of the bed cut down, and we're going to start assembling them down here in the shop. We're going to do this a little differently than you normally would. So we're only going to assemble the sides and the top and the bottom down here. Then we're going to carry that upstairs, attach it to the plywood sheet that we can then put against the wall. Then after that, we'll go ahead and put the drawer fronts on them. So for now, let's just use pocket hole joinery to assemble the sides, tops, and bottoms of these cabinets. So that on-camera segment was recorded while I still thought this was such a great idea to put the plywood sheets against the wall and then use that, basically the wall, as the back for all the cabinets. Because I thought I could just screw right into the wall wherever I wanted, and I thought I was going to make alignment easy. But there were a number of issues and flaws in this plan that I discovered as I went along. Now on to the 200 or so pocket holes I had to drill for this. Now, pocket holes don't get a lot of love, but they really served a purpose for this project because I could hide most of them, except for the fact that...
All right, so just had a major setback. After drilling about 100 pocket holes, I discovered that the collet on my Kreg drill bit had slipped. So the holes on like 97 of them were way too deep. I had to go back through all of those holes, like it was like 100 of them, and plug those with dowels, sand them down so we could get back to where we started. And now I have to re-drill all of them at the proper depth. Lesson learned: every few holes, I'm just throwing the bit right back into the Kreg jig so I can just double check that the length is correct. Simple enough to do, and it's going to give me some peace of mind. I don't know, maybe it'll prevent somebody else having the same thing happen to them. So let's go do this again.
So I won't subject you to pocket hole boredom anymore. I'll just say after 2 days of nothing but pocket holes, I was ready to be done with them and move on to assembling the cabinets. However, before I could assemble the cabinets, there was one more task that seemed small, but because of the sheer number of cabinets, actually ended up taking me another probably day and a half or 2 days, and that was edge banding all the pieces of the wood. I just used some iron-on edge banding that I got some big rolls of on Etsy. I'm going to put a link in the description because it's a really good source for higher quality edge banding, and in this case I got maple that matched the plywood very well. And these edge banding tools are invaluable when you have a lot of edge banding to do. They really help take it off much quicker than using a razor blade like I've done in the past. I also picked up a J-roller tool instead of just relying on the pressure of the iron to push the edge banding onto the piece of wood. And this really did help it adhere better, and I think gave me much higher quality results in the end. With all the edge banding done, it was time to move on to assembling the cabinets, and I started with the upper cabinets that would go above the bed. And just to clarify, while that rendering showed one large cabinet, I actually made 2 cabinets because the span of the upper cabinets was longer than 8 feet, so I couldn't make it out of 1 sheet of plywood and just broke it into 2. And the design was very straightforward, just basically a box. I'll probably go back and add some shelving or organization to it later, but for now there was enough going on in this build, I just kept it simple. Next, I moved on to assembling the side cabinets. These are going to have shelves on the interior and drawer fronts that will make the whole cabinet facade have a clean, modern look. Now, the first cabinet I was able to assemble using pocket holes from the interior that I'd drilled into the shelves themselves. However, for the second cabinet, which was a bit narrower, I couldn't get my drill inside to screw into the pocket holes, even though that was what I planned on using. So I changed up the plan and decided to screw in from the side and use dowels to conceal the screws for the shelves. I first drilled a small pilot hole for the screws, then I would use a Forstner bit that was 3/8 inches to drill a larger hole that the screw head would sit inside of. I'd then go back with the dowels to cover the screw head. This technique of coming in from the side and using dowels to cover the screw heads was actually easier, so I wish I'd actually done that for the other shelf as well. But again, live and learn, and hindsight's 2020. Next, I moved on to making the floating nightstands and the drawers that would go inside them. I made the drawers first because I thought it might be easier to assemble them and then cut the floating cabinets to exactly the right size to fit the drawers and hardware. The sides of the drawers are going to be made from 1/2-inch plywood, and I started by cutting a 1/4-inch channel in the sides using my router table. Then took those sides over to the table saw and cut them down to the exact dimensions for the drawers. Then I cut the bottoms for the drawers from some 1/4-inch MDF, and in retrospect, because of the width of the drawers, probably should have gone with 1/2-inch material for the base, but it seems to be holding up okay for now. To assemble the drawers, I just kept it really simple. I used wood glue in the slots between the MDF and the sides, squared it up, and then used my cordless nailer to secure the drawers while the glue dried. Then I decided to give the drawers a little bit of a personal touch by first spray painting them gray and then using street art stencils and Montana Gold spray paint to put some cool designs on the underside and the inside of the drawers. Since this is a built-in bed, I envision it staying in my loft even after I sell it and move on. And so this was a cool way of doing something personal but hidden so it wouldn't mess up the more general appeal of the bed and hurt resale value in the end. To assemble the floating nightstands, I just used glue and pocket holes to connect the sides to the top of the cabinet. However, for the bottom of the cabinet, the location of the drawer slides prevented me from using pocket hole joinery. And since you wouldn't see the underside of these cabinets, I just used a Forstner bit to drill a pilot hole and then screws straight into the sides from the bottom. Next, it was on to installing the drawer hardware, and I actually removed the bottoms of the drawers just to make it a bit easier to do the install. For the slides, I used some soft close hardware that I got off Amazon, and I used Rockler's drawer slide installation jig, which made it a bit easier to get the job done. I'm not going to provide a whole lot of details on that process because there's a ton of videos out there on installing drawer slides, and I didn't do anything differently than any of those will teach you. Before installing the shelves and floating nightstands, I had to install the plywood wall panels, which were just made from 3.5 4x8 plywood sheets. I'll explain why these plywood wall panels weren't such a good idea in a minute, but first I'm going to show you some things I did to prepare the panels before installing them. I cut out some rough holes for outlets, and I'm gonna have an electrician come back later, so I didn't worry about making those too pretty right now. I also used a Forstner bit to drill holes in locations where screws would be at visible locations, so I could go back and use dowels to cover those screws later. Now let's go back to the question of how I thought this was a good idea in the first place. The previous owners of my loft had covered the drywall with wallpaper, and I hate drywalling and I didn't want to mess with removing wallpaper. So it seemed like it would be easy with the metal studs there, using special screws I found that were designed to screw through the drywall and attach metal studs to attach a bunch of plywood sheets across the entire wall. The first fundamental issue is that working with huge sheets of plywood is just unwieldy and was really difficult to get them installed. I ended up enlisting my parents to help me out. The second and biggest issue was that the wall itself was bowed by about, I'd say, an inch or so from the middle to the sides. And this meant that the plywood sheets didn't form a flat surface when they were just screwed directly through the drywall to the studs. That ultimately created a lot of problems when trying to install the cabinets and get them flush, since I was using these plywood sheets as the backs of the cabinets. A better system would have been to use some long French cleats that would run the length of the wall and could be easily shimmed out to be flat to install the long runs of cabinets. But live and learn. If anyone else tries this, I just don't recommend doing it this way. I decided to bring all the cabinets and the floating nightstands upstairs to the bedroom to do the staining there, just so I had a little bit more space. And as usual, the supervisor was making sure everything went smoothly. I decided to use General Finishes black water-based gel stain on the cabinet. When I was trying different stains, I really liked this one because it was black, but it let the grain of the wood show through, which is what I wanted with the maple. However, I will say that there was another small mistake in this step. It really would have been better to stain all the pieces of wood before assembling the cabinets. With this stain, you wipe it on and wipe it off immediately, and it's really important to get an even look that you do the whole surface at once, which is really challenging to do once the cabinets are assembled. I would stain all the wood before assembly if I did this again. After the stain had dried for 24 hours, I applied 4 coats of polyacrylic matte finish off camera. And then it was time to install the floating nightstands and the surround cabinets. I shimmed up the floating nightstand on the left side and then used some heavy-duty L brackets to install it into the plywood wall. I couldn't find any way to show this on camera, but I did make sure that one of the L brackets was located on a metal stud. I then installed 2 heavy-duty L brackets that would hold the side cabinet. Now I used a scrap piece of plywood with a level here to make sure that the 2 brackets were perfectly level and spaced from the top of the plywood by exactly the width of a plywood sheet, so the top of the cabinet would line up with the top of the plywood wall panel. I then screwed one of the L brackets to the scrap piece of plywood and extended my level across the installed cabinet and the scrap piece so that the L bracket could be used as a guide for pre-drilling holes, which would then result in the top cabinet being perpendicular across its top with the existing cabinet. I then repeated this process to install the second top cabinet and the right side cabinet before moving on to install the second floating nightstand on the right side of the bed.
Okay, got a little issue with installation because I can't access these drawers from the back when they're closed, and we need to get these inset drawer fronts aligned with the cabinet. So what we're going to do is just use hot glue, attach it temporarily with the hot glue, and then that way, once we get it aligned and adjusted using the hot glue, get it dialed in, we can go back and attach it permanently with screws from behind.
After the drawer fronts were installed, I removed the drawers to install the handles. The screws that came with the handle were designed for 3/4 inch wood, and so I had to use a Forstner bit to clear out the 1/2 inch plywood in the back so that the handle would fit tightly through the 3/4 inch maple front. Next, I went back to the shop to prepare the doors for the side cabinets and top cabinets for the soft close hinges I was going to use. To make the cutouts in the door panels, I used a 1 3/8 inch Forstner bit on my drill press. Now off camera, I had done some tests to get set the depth stop on the drill press to fit the hinges, but I wanted to test fit it there quickly, made sure it was good, and then moved on to do the cutouts for the rest of the hinges. I used the right angle tool to align the hinges perpendicular to the sides of the doors, then used the hinge itself as a template for a center punch to mark where to drill for the hinge screws. I shimmed each door up to where I wanted it on the cabinet carcass, and then marked the center point of each hinge on the inside of the cabinet carcass. I made an acrylic copy of the template for the cut pattern that came with the hinges. I clamped the acrylic hole guide so that its center line was aligned with the holes I'd marked on the inside of the carcass, then drilled the holes for the mating part of each hinge. And with that, I could attach the doors for the cabinets.
So we're about halfway through the bed build. We've got the cabinet surrounding the bed done, and it's time to move on and actually make the bed itself.
And I was pretty excited that at this point it was starting to look a lot like my SketchUp model. And by the way, if you're into design decisions or just seeing stuff behind the scenes, go follow me on Instagram because I make a lot of community design decisions over there as my builds are in progress. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still a lot to do.
So what you see here behind me is the first bed that I made when I moved into this loft. And it had a wood wall there originally that I've taken down. The bed itself is made from a 2x4 frame and select pine. Now the select pine won't match the maple that we use for the cabinets. So what I'm going to try to do is take this apart, and then I'm hoping that we can actually reuse the 2x4 frame from this and then just skin it in maple plywood to simplify the bed build. So let's get going disassembling this and see what we find underneath.
And while I'm tearing down that old bed, let's take a minute and talk about this video's sponsor, Audible. Audible has a massive selection of audiobooks, and now with Audible Originals, the selection has expanded even further. Audible Originals are exclusive audio titles created by celebrated storytellers just for Audible members. Every month, Audible members get 1 credit good for any audiobook they choose, plus 2 Audible Originals that they can't get anywhere else. Personally, I've really enjoyed listening to audiobooks while I'm in the shop. I've recently been listening to a book called Creativity, The Psychology of Discovery and Invention. It explores the creative process and some of the most creative people in the world. One idea I found very intriguing was that it's perhaps more important to put yourself in situations that lead to creativity than it is to have some innate ability to think creatively. Definitely recommend this book if you're looking for ways to inject creativity into your projects. Right now, Audible is offering my subscribers their first audiobook for free when you try Audible for 30 days. Just visit audible.com/Medustrial or text Medustrial to 500-500 to sign up.
So there is one modification I'm going to have to make to the frame from the old bed that I'm reusing. And that is that the old frame had built-in tables. This one's not, obviously. So we're going to have to cut these down. And the frame is just really the width of 2 2x3s. I'll put in another 2x3 there. It will hold 2 pieces of maple plywood at a right angle that'll create the illusion of a thicker square.
I also reused the platform from my old bed. Now, if you don't have this, I'll leave a link to a video that'll show you how to make one of your own out of inexpensive 1x4s. But since I had this platform, I used it as a guide to make sure that I was squaring up all the sides of the 2x3 frame correctly. I then used screws to attach the frame, and this does not have to be pretty at all. I just basically hacked this together. This is probably because the old bed was one of the first projects I've ever done, and if I was designing from the ground up, I probably would have done this a very different way. But, you know, I had the frame, so I figured why not use it, and I think skinning it was a solution that worked out pretty well, at least at the end result. The first step of skinning the bed was to mark and drill for dowels in the top pieces. So I first laid out all the top pieces of the sides and front. I then used a right angle tool to mark where the dowels would go. And lastly, disassembled it and used a doweling jig to drill the holes for the dowels. I used the dowels because the 2x3 frame was not perfectly parallel to the ground or square, and that could lead to the top boards being uneven with one another. So the dowels just help those boards to line up and be flush with one another. To attach the skin pieces to the frame, I just am going to use pocket hole joineries, and they won't be visible again, so not a big deal, and they're really an ideal way to quickly join these large pieces. I then used the same black stain, and this time I learned to stain before assembling the bed frame, which made it easier, and then basically made a bunch of big L sections that would skin around the outsides of the bed and give the appearance of a larger beam when they were installed. And continuing with the theme of just sort of hacking this together, I just used screws going up through the 2x3s into the plywood frame. And I forgot to get footage of this, but I also had drilled pocket holes into the 2x3 spacer pieces at the bottom of the frame and used those pocket holes to attach the frame to the plywood sides. So with that, I had repurposed the old bed into the new bed. Now I'm going to go back and walk through all the electronics, and that starts actually before the cabinet install, so we'll go back in time a bit. So I'm using my Shaper Origin computer vision assisted handheld router to cut out a hole here for one of the outlets that'll go in the side of the side cabinet by the bed. Total overkill, but I really liked and wanted to try out the concept of bringing a handheld CNC to the job site to make really precise, accurate cuts there instead of having to lug the cabinets to the shop. I also used the Shaper Origin to cut out L-shaped recessed cavities in the underside of the top cabinets that would accept some LED lighting and give a really cool overhead lighting for the bed. To hide the wiring for the outlets and lighting, I drilled holes inside the cabinets that wouldn't be seen when the cabinet doors were closed. To control the overhead strip lighting, I got these black glass-faced touch controllers that I think will match the look of the bed really well. That said, if anyone knows any wall-mounted DC switches that would allow for Alexa controllers, let me know in the comments below because I'd like to install them. So I mentioned earlier that the Shaper Origin was a bit overkill for this project of just cutting out the controllers. So I'm showing here how you can just cut out the holes with a jigsaw and Forstner bit, although cutting it out after the cabinet is installed was a terrible idea. I 100% should have done this before installing the cabinets and the wall. For the bedside outlets, I found these really cool extension outlets which look and install just like regular outlets but have an extension cord running down the back. So I could thread that through the cabinet and into my existing outlet. I then moved on to installing the LED strip lighting in the channels I'd cut in the underside of the upper cabinets. So I'm not sure that anyone else is going to have the exact same kind of lighting over their bed, but I just want to throw out there as an idea that this would make a really kind of cool under cabinet lighting in a kitchen or even in a bathroom over a vanity. So this temporary installation was pretty straightforward, but I did have to solder some extension wire from the LED strips to reach the controller and connectors between two pieces so it would fit smoothly around the L shape in the channel. I drilled a hole through the LED channel, fed the power and ground wires that I'd soldered on through that hole into the upper cabinet, and then used the adhesive tape on the back of the LED strip to attach it in the channel. Remember that bow I mentioned in the wall? Well, it actually created some space between the shelves and the wall in this cabinet, which I took advantage of to run the wiring through. If it hadn't been there, I would have had to drill some holes in the shelves. I then wired up the LED touch controller, which is very straightforward. There's just a power and ground in and a power and ground out. So the power and ground out went up through the cabinet to the LED strips, and I connected a pigtail adapter to the LED in, which could then connect to the 12-volt power source. I then went back down to the workshop to cut out L-shaped white acrylic diffusers, which will give the LEDs a really nice solid look. And I just used a table saw and jigsaw to do this. So I first made a cut through at the thickness of the channel, and I didn't go all the way through. So I left a L-shaped piece there and then cut it out roughly with the jigsaw. I then took the smaller L section back to the table saw and really carefully using the micro jig for protection, made another cut that again didn't go all the way through, but cut it to the same exact width of the channel. And since I'd cut the channels with a router, the inside corners were rounded and not square, and so I just took the same 1/4 inch radius and marked it with a dowel and used my sander to round over the edges to the marks. Now, one important note here is that before I had cut the acrylic diffusers, I had made some test cuts on small pieces to dial in the width so it was the exact same width as the channel in the plywood. This allowed me to press fit the LED diffuser right in, so the LED diffuser almost looks like an inlay with a nice flush fit into the plywood. Then it was on to making the slab headboard / wall art that would sit behind the bed. Now, I'd purchased a slab that had already been planed for me, so all I had to do was cut it to size and finish it. The trickiest part was getting the two sides cut parallel to one another. So to do this, I just marked a straight line on one side where I wanted to cut it. I then used a right angle tool as a guide for a beefy tape measure that I could extend straight across and mark a line perpendicular to the other line I marked, and then I could mark a line perpendicular to that and know that it was parallel to the other side. I then pulled out my track saw to cut along those lines, making a second thin pass on each side to make sure that I got a clean, blade mark free surface. Now, there were some pretty bad lines in the wood from planing it, and so I pulled out my belt sander and gave it a pass with 80 grit to remove those lines and get a nice smooth surface to start with. I then pulled out my random orbit sander and sanded it down up to 240 grit. Then it was time to apply the finish, and for this slab I decided to use a matte polyacrylic, and honestly I think I probably could have used anything on this piece of wood because man did that grain pop, and just look at it. I mean, this piece of wood is spectacular. I am going to love waking up and looking at this every day. I then moved over to the table saw, set it to 45 degrees, and cut some scrap plywood to make strips to use for French cleats. I then used my cordless nailer to attach two of the strips to the back of the slab. I made a mistake here because I was using scrap plywood, and I'd planned to just have the two pieces extend parallel to one another as if they were one long piece. But after nailing in the first piece, I realized that extending the second piece straight along from it would actually have exposed the second piece above the live edge. So I ended up staggering the two French cleats.
We're in the final stretch here. Just going to show you a few things off camera that I did. Put in the French cleats on the wall. Again, you see how they're staggered. That is because I messed up when I put the cleats onto the back of the live edge slabs. I was thinking I was going to put some sort of tile or something else on this area behind the bed, or maybe even paint that portion of the wood. But I actually decided with the live edge slab hanging there in the maple, the light maple, I really like the contrast of the black wall, so I just decided to stain it with the same stain that I used on the rest of the cabinet.
And with that, there were only a couple finishing touches left. I made a last-minute decision to add some LED strips underneath the bed to give it a cool floating glow. And I just used some warm white LED strips and attached them with the adhesive backing. I also went back with some hot glue just because in my experience, adhesive backing tends to give out and fall off over time. And I'll have to go back and add a controller for these later. Right now, they're just hardwired in because it was a last minute decision. Lastly, I built a headboard, which was basically a square plywood box that stayed in the same color, put behind the bed, and with that, the bed was done. All right, guys, so this was a 7-month project in the making, and I'm really happy how it finally turned out. I finally have a bedroom I wanted in my loft, and I hope you guys dig it too. As always, if you like this video, remember to hit that subscribe button, hit that bell button next to the subscribe button so that you get actually reminded when I upload new videos, and hit that like button to let YouTube know that you enjoyed this video. Also, remember to go grab your first book for free from Audible by going to audible.com/Medustrial or texting Medustrial to 500-500. That's it for this time, and I'll see you next time.